Hello everyone, welcome back to Hand and Killer7, and welcome back to our look at the timeline of the game. Last time we started off at the beginning, the year 1750, which saw the births of Harmon Deltahead and Kun Lan, and we ended in the year 1957, when Killer7 first entered the world. So there's a long way to go between 1957 and the events of the game, which took place in 2010 and 2011. So Killer7 was around for quite some time before that happened. So we have to get to there, and then we have to also go through the game to the end of the timeline, which ends in the year 2171. And that's what we're going to be doing right now. So let's see what events happen between 1957 and the year 2171. Okay, 1957. Second Smith Syndicate is formed. Next, 2 years later, we're introduced to Curtis Blackburn. He starts to get involved in underground societies, but he's actually working for the US government, so he's doing dirty work. But he's not part of a gang, not part of the mafia or anything. He's doing the government's dirty work, which is the dirtiest work of all. This is when he gets started. And then, in 1967, Hiro Kasai met Harmon Smith in Hakone, Japan. He had a mission for Harmon. Kasai wanted Harmon to investigate the security of the votes of countries involved with the Asian Security Treaty. After his investigation, Harmon promised Kasai that the treaty would be ratified, and gave Kasai the report of his investigation. Harmon Smith met the chairman of the countries who were members of the Asian Security Treaty. The treaty was ratified, and Japan became a member of the council. In front of Harmon, the chairman committed suicide. So this is a bit of the timeline we've heard in a couple other parts. We've heard this in Jaco's report. We've also heard this, I believe, in the faction section. This important meeting that took place in Hakone, Japan, where Harmon Smith had to investigate who was voting for which plan. There were 3 plans that they had to vote on. And Harmon somehow found out the result of the vote before it happened, and I guess he told Hiro Kasai about it. However, whichever plan won, that vote was not made public for whatever reason. We're not really told why. But according to Jaco's reports, from this meeting is the point when the world's history became maligned, or in other words, manipulated, taken off its natural course, and controlled to try to bring the world along a certain path. This is where this started. I don't know why the chairman is committing suicide in front of Harmon. Not sure why that's happening, but it did. But something that seems kind of strange to me about this is that the person who gave Harmon this mission is Hiro Kasai. It's the first time we've seen that. We met Kasai in the game. In the year 2010, Garcian talks to him before Garcian goes to the Kaku building. So, Kasai did not seem to me to be quite that old. 1967 would be 43 years before then, I guess? Before 2010? And you would assume that if Kasai is giving Harmon this mission, then Kasai must already be an adult. I did not really put Kasai in the game as being in his 70s or 80s, but he's gotta be, according to this timeline. Of course, if he's not, that wouldn't be exactly the strangest thing about this timeline. Wouldn't exactly be the thing that makes the least sense. Going on to 1969. Nice. Travis Bell became the first victim of the second Smith Syndicate. Travis did say that he was the chief's first catch. In the first level, he reminisces about being killed, remembers how the feeling went up and down his spine, and actually felt pretty good. And then ever since then, Travis hung around with the Smiths, talking to them, talking about politics, about what's going on in the world. Just kind of an odd thing, though. If the second Smith Syndicate started in 1957, they didn't actually kill anyone for 12 years? That seems odd, considering they're a group of assassins. Doesn't seem like they're exactly in high demand if this group of assassins didn't kill anyone for 12 years, but what do I know? They kill Travis for whatever reason. I don't think we ever find out exactly why they do that. Travis is their target for whatever reason. 1973, Harmon Smith lost his chess game against Kun Lan. As part of his loss, Harmon promised to give Kun Lan control over the major cities of the west coast of the United States of America. Harmon began the process by sending Dan Smith to Curtis Blackburn in Seattle to destroy the small gangs there and establish Blackburn's control. Christopher Mills, as a young boy, became Blackburn's informant and entered the world of underground society. So an important point here, Harmon Smith loses a chess game against Kun Lan. Now, playing the game, it kind of sounds like that doesn't happen. Kun Lan does mention that Harmon always wins their chess games. Seems like that was not the case, as Harmon did lose one in 1973, and we could see what's exactly at stake, the magnitude of what's at stake in these chess games, as when Harmon loses, he gives Kun Lan control over the west coast of the US. And this is what leads to Dan Smith meeting Curtis Blackburn, as he's assisting Curtis in establishing Blackburn's control. Blackburn himself working for Kun Lan, that's mentioned in Jaco's reports. And then this is how Mills gets involved in underground society. It's also how Mills meets Dan Smith. We saw in the characters section, it did say that the two of them do know each other, but they're not exactly friendly. Now, just one thing I was thinking of. This might explain something odd about Coburn Elementary School. Last time it did say that Coburn was funded by mysterious capitalists who wanted the school to train students in the ways of capitalism, so they would go forth and propagate capitalism. But when we go to Coburn in the game, it doesn't really seem like that's the case anymore. According to Holbert, the purpose of the school is to train Yakumo party members, who will then go on to be troublemakers in the US. Maybe Coburn went to Kun Lan's control after this chess game, when Kun Lan controlled the west coast of the US, since Coburn Elementary is in Washington State. Maybe it's at this point that the transition happens. 2 years later, 1975, Blackburn ended his role as Dan Smith's mentor. On a basketball court, Curtis shot Dan to death. Garcia and Smith recovered Dan's corpse, and he obtained the power to resurrect the dead. I guess Dan and Curtis didn't know each other all that long. It was only 2 years. And I believe it was said that Curtis killed Dan because Pedro framed Dan. Made Curtis think that Dan was stealing from Curtis, when in fact it was Pedro all along. An odd thing here is that it says, well, this is the first time we see Garcian's name. We've seen Amir's name before, but this is the first time Garcian Smith appears in the timeline. It says that upon recovering Dan's corpse, he gains the power to resurrect the dead. So I guess he didn't have that before. And, of course, we don't hear of him having that power when he is Amir. This is where he gets it, but why? Why would this give him the power to resurrect the dead? It doesn't really explain. Just that, from 1975 onward, Garcian is now able to resurrect the Killer7. How did he get that power? I don't know. But one thing I will say is that it's kind of funny, looking at when this took place, 1975, and thinking of the last time Blackburn saw Dan Smith was in 1975 when he shoots him dead on a basketball court. In the year 2011, so what is that, 36 years later, Curtis watches Dan Smith enter his house. Dan looks exactly the same as he did in 1975, and also alive. You'd think Curtis would be a bit more startled about that. Really, he doesn't seem bothered by it at all. But I guess Curtis has probably seen some things. Working in the line of work he has, working for Kun Lan, he's probably seen some weird things. Maybe this was not the weirdest of things, but he seems like he takes it pretty well when that actually happens in the game. Moving on to 3 years later. 1978, the Killer7 took a mission from the head of a Spanish organization that specialized in cleaning up the aftermath of accidents. They left for Spain. The target was the son of one of the organization's workers, Kess Bloody Sunday. Well, we do know that Kess was killed by the Smiths, so a little mention of him. I guess Kess lived in Spain. Nothing really else mentioning anything about it. All we know is that Kess was a serial killer, and he was such a prolific serial killer that he had to be killed himself. The Smiths had to be hired to take out Kess. That's really all we know about him, though. Moving on to 1980, Kevin Smith fought the pharmaceutical mafia in Miami, Florida. During the fight, Kevin killed the man he loved. Little background on Kevin, who is a character who kind of remains maybe the most mysterious of the Killer7. We never really find out anything about him. He never talks. We don't really know what his opinions are on anything. But it does mention that in 1980 he fought the pharmaceutical mafia in Florida. I don't know how the pharmaceutical mafia fits into the overall storyline in the game. Maybe this was just a job that the Killer7 were hired for, and maybe Kevin Smith was the primary persona that did battle against the mafia. Also, apparently, in that fight, there was some romance, which is something that you don't actually get in Killer7. Thinking about it, no one really loves each other in Killer7. Everyone in Killer7 is a bad person who just has a really nihilistic viewpoint on the world and just thinks that, we're all here just to kill each other until we ourselves are killed. The idea of a romance happening in Killer7, from the characters we see, I don't know who it would be. Who are you going to romance? Samantha? I don't think that's happening. None of the characters we see in this game, I can't really imagine having some sort of relationship. Though some people did say that the factions section implied that Kaede was choosing between Dan and Coyote. And I don't know what kind of relationship that was like, but apparently there was something there. But from what we see in the game, really not much in the way of love or romance. But it seems that in 1980, Kevin Smith did have to kill the man he loved. We don't find anything out more about this other than that. 1982, in Madison Square Garden, Masked Smith fought a decisive battle against an army of prototype Heaven Smiles and Mask Smiles. Kunlan's shadow began to creep over the second Smith syndicate. There are parts of this timeline that make me really sad that we don't get to see them in the game, and this is one of them. In 1982, in Madison Square Garden, it's Masked Smith versus an army of Smiles. And I like to think that it takes place in the arena, that there's a wrestling ring set up, Mask is standing in the center of the wrestling ring, and the prototype Heaven Smiles are just charging the ring. And it's him versus all of them. This is something that I wish we could see, we cannot see, unfortunately. It mentions that Kunlan's shadow begins to creep over the Smiths. I assume this means that Kunlan is beginning to infiltrate Garcian's spiritual basement. I assume it means that Garcian starts to hear yelling coming from the basement of his trailer house. He never checks it out. He never goes to see who's yelling down there. But I assume this is when the yelling started. Moving on to 1987, 5 years later. Using their connections within Seattle's base for the nation's self-defense department, Curtis Blackburn and Pedro Montana created a black market organ trafficking route. They did this by manipulating the immigration department's procedures. So, an interesting thing here is that from the timeline, it says that Curtis and Pedro started their whole orphan thing after Dan's death. Well after it. But when playing that chapter in the game and talking to Travis, it makes Travis sounds like Dan was around that from the beginning. It sounds like Dan was part of that. The timeline says no. The timeline says that Curtis and Pedro were not actually doing that when Dan was alive, or when Dan was working for Curtis. Rather, they started this afterward. And I guess maybe that makes Dan seem not so bad if he was not actually part of the whole orphan trading thing, extracting organs from orphans, that whole thing. I guess maybe Dan was not involved in that after all. December 1990. A lot more text here. In southern France, the Killer7 took on a mission to dissolve a secret meeting that was scheduled to be held at a first-class resort hotel. There, They confronted large numbers of rollout Heaven Smiles. The Killer7 decimated the Heaven Smiles, but an unknown woman appeared in front of them. She killed one persona after another. She nearly annihilated the Second Smith Syndicate. In the end, though, Harmon Smith successfully cut her down. The personae were so heavily damaged, it took Garcia and Smith 10 years to resurrect all of them. During this time, the activity of the Second Smith Syndicate was suspended. Samantha Sitbin began serving Harmon Smith. In the absence of the other personae, she took work as a persona of the Killer7. Alright, some background on Samantha, and it is kind of surprising, because it turns out that she was an assassin herself, and that she was killed in December 1990, but not before nearly killing all of the Smiths. But she did damage them so much that for an entire decade, the Killer7 was out of commission because Garcian had to take 10 years to resurrect them. And in that period of time, Samantha became the assassin of the Killer7. She became a killer persona. So she started becoming... She became Samantha Smith at that point in time, and we do hear that name, we do see that name in a letter, which I believe is going to be referenced pretty soon. In 1992, Holbert, an FBI special agent, infiltrated Coburn Elementary School and was murdered. We know about this, but the thing that's weird... In 1992, Garcian was Garcian. He was not Amir Parkreiner anymore. So who killed Holbert in the school? In his last tape, he meets Amir face to face, and Amir kills him. That is what we hear. But Amir shot himself on the Union Hotel decades ago, and he is now Garcian Smith. So what happened in elementary school? How did Amir appear there to kill Holbert? Or is this just an inconsistency with the timeline? You know, I can't say it's not. It might be, but I don't know how Amir Parkreiner showed up in Coburn Elementary School at the time. Also, I don't know how Amir attended Coburn Elementary School to begin with, because that was never mentioned on the timeline. The only time he might have been able to do it is the period of time where it says that the U.S. took Amir and his parents and put them in an isolated state, right? And then that ended with Amir killing his parents, Michael and Catherine, and then escaping to parts unknown. Maybe at that point in time, maybe Amir was attending Coburn Elementary. Maybe the isolated state they were talking about was Washington State, and that's where he was going to school. It doesn't mention it, but it seems like that's the only point on the timeline where this could actually happen. But then again, who was it in Coburn Elementary School that killed Holbert? Who did Holbert meet? I don't know. I can't think of anything from the information we've already seen that would indicate to us what happened there. So we're moving on to 1998, where the world enjoyed its first year of total peace. The international community banned all air transportation in the interest of suppressing terrorism. The analog network system rapidly developed. Alright, so we know that the UN banned air transportation, not really so much because of suppressing terrorism, but because they wanted to control trade throughout the world. That's mentioned in the factions section. The analog network system is being developed, and we know that's being worked on by ISZK Corporation, because analog systems are their thing. That's what they're good at. And when digital technology was banned and analog came back, it was big business for ISZK. The next year, Samantha Smith, who was a temporary persona of Harmon, killed Johnny Gagnon. So this is when Johnny was alive, and this is when he was sending out his carrier pigeons in 1999. Those carrier pigeons were looking to deliver those messages for a long time, because we get them in 2010 and 2011, so they've been flying around for quite some time looking for Amir. Now, this explains why Samantha gets the name Samantha Smith. it's because at a point in time, she was the only one who was actually taking assassination jobs for the Killer7, since all the other Killer7 were dead and Garcine was busy trying to resurrect them. So Samantha Smith kills Johnny Gagnon, but at the same time, Johnny was trying to send those carrier pigeons to Amir, who was Garcine at this point. So that's kind of curious. Who was Johnny hired by? It couldn't have been the actual Amir, because that's Garcine, and Garcine is not Amir at this point in time. Maybe this has to do with who killed Holbert in the elementary school. Holbert meets Amir there. At basically the same point in time, during the 90s, Johnny is hired by someone named Amir to tell him about the Smith syndicate. And then the carrier pigeons find the Killer7 and deliver the messages to them. So who hired Johnny for this? Again, thinking about the materials we've seen, I can't really think of any information that would give us any info on that. I mean, there is something in Jaco's reports that does indicate that Jaco was trying to give information to Garcine, and I don't know if that's supposed to indicate that maybe he was sending the carrier pigeons? I mean, Jaco Checkbox is a character who does not exist in the game, but is also very important to the game, and also is never mentioned in this timeline, so he basically has the freedom to operate outside the timeline and the game, and maybe anything that doesn't make sense can just be attributed to him, because he could have done it. There's nothing in the materials that say he couldn't have done it. He could have. Maybe he's just the Deus Ex Machina. This doesn't make sense. I guess Jacob Checkbox did it, because nothing contradicts that. I don't know, maybe that is. Maybe that's actually the case. In the year 2000, Garcine Smith succeeded in resurrecting all of the fallen personae. The second Smith syndicate was back. However, Dan Smith tried to kill Harmon in a fit of lunacy. Harmon was wounded mortally. He fell into a state of suspended animation. Samantha left her work as a killer persona and began taking care of him. So, the manual does correspond with this, that Dan Smith tried to kill Harmon, and then Harmon fell into his comatose state for 10 years. So, a crimp in the plans of the second Smith Syndicate. They're all back. Garcine resurrected them, but now Harmon has a problem. And this is when Samantha starts taking care of him, if that's what you want to call that. Though this does bring up a question. Samantha clearly wants to leave the trailer house because she has classes to take. And Garcine is clearly paying Samantha to take care of Harmon. So Samantha, even though she is a persona, can she leave? Can she just leave the trailer house and go to college and take classes? I guess. Because she does it in the game. And you kind of assume she's just like a separate living human being. Apparently she is not. She was killed and absorbed into Harmon and became a persona. So how is it that she actually leaves the trailer house? I don't know. Maybe I'm just not supposed to think about it like that. But I am thinking about it like that. But in the year 2000, this is what happened. Then, in the year 2002, the network of intercontinental expressways opened. Right? Air travel is banned. You have to drive across the oceans. Look, it's no problem. Just drive across the Atlantic Ocean. You'll cross it in no time. Hope there are some rest stops. Then in 2003, construction of the International Mass-Scale Transportation System began. Radioactive waste and other materials were sent to an energy disposal facility, a dome structure built in the Indian Ocean. The international community's ultimate goal was to eliminate all intercontinental missiles. The number of terrorist attacks using Heaven's Smiles increased. So as the world's nuclear stockpile went down, the number of Heaven's Smiles started to go up. I mean, what use are nuclear missiles against such creatures? The meaning of terrorism has changed, as the game told us. You know, I was never actually sure if the energy disposal facility in the Indian Ocean, is that supposed to be Battleship Island? It's mentioned in the beginning of the game, this facility. It's mentioned that it's built on a man-made island. and I assume it's Battleship Island, but I don't know that for sure. I could not say. Then, 7 years later, the year 2010, Chapter 1, Angel, Harmon Smith returned. The battle in the Celtic building occurred. So, 10 years later, Harmon recovers. Not permanently, but he does wake up. So I guess the beginning of the game, when we go into the Celtic building and do the first level, this is when Harmon first returns. Previous to this, he has been comatose for 10 years. But I guess with the return of Kun Lan, Harmon has also woken up. Same year, 2010, Sunset. Got some small text going on here. Let's see what happened. 200 missiles launched toward Japan. Julia Kasugi was contracted by Christopher Mills to kill Toru Fukushima. At the restaurant Fukushima, Kasugi, Jean de Paul, and the Killer7 met. De Paul was an agent for the International Ethics Committee. Kasugi killed Fukushima, but the location of the Yakumo cabinet policy was unknown. Hiro Kasai informed Garcia and Smith that Jean de Paul had infiltrated the Kaku building, wherein the final secret meeting was held between the United States and Japan. The Killer7 headed for the Kaku building. There, they fought a spiritual battle with Hiroyasu Kurahashi and Shinya Akiba. Meanwhile, Kenjiro Matsuoka was chosen by Kun Lan as his messiah. The missiles hit Tokyo, Osaka, Fukuoka, and Sapporo, the 4 major cities in Japan. Japan was obliterated. A few things to mention here. So this is Sunset. A number of things happened. 1, 200 missiles launched towards Japan. Even the timeline is not going to tell us who launched those missiles. Who did it? I mean, I always thought maybe it was the US, but you would think that the Pentagon would know, and they clearly did not know. Whoever launched the missiles launched it over the US towards Japan. So if those missiles were launched from, say, Europe, they launched them over the Atlantic Ocean, over the US, over the Pacific Ocean towards Japan, from what we see in Sunset. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but the timeline still does not tell us who actually launched these missiles. There's also something here that I think is wrong. It says Julia Kasugi was contracted by Christopher Mills to kill Fukushima. Mills didn't contract Kasugi. She was contracted by the Liberal Party in Japan. They wanted Julia to kill Fukushima so the Liberal Party could take power. It wouldn't make sense for Mills to contract Julia to do that. Mills, of course, told the Killer7 to kill Fukushima. So this is a weird thing it states here, and I don't know if there's a problem with the translation or what, but that doesn't make sense to me. Oh, and also one thing. I like how it mentions, when it talks about the Kaku building, it talks about a spiritual battle with Kurahashi and Akiba. So sure, yeah, let's call it that. Remember this? This thing? Where they spit brains at us? Let's call this a spiritual battle. Because what else do you call this? I mean, with the two of them going... So I guess how you say that. Vomiting their brains up at us while we have to shoot them in the brains. Yes, a spiritual battle indeed. So those are the events of Sunset. Same year, August 2010, Cloudman. Andre Olmeda announced on television that the amphitheater wherein Stacey Spangles was given a concert would be blown up by Heaven Smiles. During his public declaration of the act of terrorism, Olmeda challenged Garcia and Smith to find him out. Garcia left for Texas. There, he witnessed Olmeda turn everything over to Clements. Yeah, he did witness that. The turning over to Clements. He also witnessed this. I guess we're just not going to talk about that. So, we already saw all this. The only thing it doesn't mention is that what we saw in Jaco's reports was that Olmeda was informed about the Heaven Smile attack on the Stacey concert by Jacob Checkbox, who had been told by Miss Jacob, who Jacob Checkbox thought was predicting the future, but the computer was not. Rather, the computer was just reciting a list of events that was going to happen, a list of events that was determined in the meeting in Hakone, Japan, when history started to become maligned. So this event, this stadium being blown up, it was always going to happen. Almeida was just there to announce it, even though the game really does make it look like he blew it up. I always thought that was the case when I played the game. The next year, 2011, Encounter. Dan and Curtis had their final confrontation. Between the Master and the Disciple, Dan brought Curtis to his end. Of course, with the help of with a pigeon on the shoulder. That's how you do it. And, appropriate music, because the Killer7 also killed Ayame Blackburn, a girl who likes wearing an anime mask and is very good with a machine gun. 2011, Alter Ego. Okay, let's see how it explains this one. Let's see what it says about this particular chapter in the game. The comic editor of ZTT published Handsome Men. Each time an issue was published, the events of the comic book occurred in the real world. The Second Smith Syndicate fought the Handsome Men in order to stop the serial murders committed by the Handsome Men. Love Wilcox enacted her vengeance toward the largest advertising company in the world, Electro and Line Inc., the force that controlled the crimes and the comic stories behind the scenes. The use of advertising as a means of propaganda and control was destroyed. Okay, so Love gets her revenge on Electro and Line. We don't know how. Love does say that she is going to get her revenge because they were responsible for the death of Trevor Pearl Harbor. Don't know how she got her revenge, but apparently she was successful. I think the thing about this chapter that I don't get is that Electro and Line controlled the Handsome Men, but the Handsome Men were online gamers led by Love. So isn't there a contradiction there? Why did the Handsome Men kill Trevor? Why did the Handsome Men fight the Killer7 if the entire point of that was just Love was just going to not fight the Killer7 and instead turn her attention to Electro and Line? I don't know. I don't have answers to any of that. But that's 2011 Alter Ego. 2011 Smile. Hiro Kasai, a member of the Liberal Party, fell from a building rooftop in front of Matsuken. And Garcia Smith recovered Amir Parkreiner's memory. Yeah, all pretty straightforward. We know about all this. Kasai being killed by Matsuken, and Garcia Smith remembering that, hey, he's Amir Parkreiner. 3 years later, 2014, Lion. The Bloody Heartland, Amir Parkreiner was awake. He entered Battleship Island alone to end everything. Deep underground, he encountered Matsuken. He killed the final Heaven Smile, Last Shot, who bore a striking resemblance to Kun Lan. So, the thing that strikes me about this is it doesn't say what choice Amir took. Did he kill Matsuoka, or did he let him live? The timeline does not actually say. So I guess, in reality, it really is our choice. The timeline does not tell us which choice was made, because the choice had to be made by us, by Amir Parkreiner, by the Bloody Heartland. And no timeline could tell him which choice he was going to make, because he was finally awake, he was finally independent, he was finally not being controlled. So how could a timeline actually say which choice he made? It can't! You gonna tell the Bloody Heartland what to do? Which choice he's gonna make? No, of course you're not. He's not listening to anyone anymore. 2017, the first event that happens after the game is over. And it's this year, the year this is being recorded. So, let's see how accurate this prediction is. In the year 2017, the United Nations dissolved for the sake of global reform. The world entered an age of total globalization. National barriers ceased to exist. Oh, well. Well, the timeline of Killer7 maybe didn't get it quite right about that point. About the point of national barriers being not existing anymore. Maybe it was a little bit wrong about that one. Let's move on to the year 2020. Part of the Yakumo cabinet policy was made public. It became the subject of devout worship. So, the Yakumo, it's an interesting question. What happens if part of it becomes public? Does anyone who looks on it just become a just like a Superman who can do anything with the strongest of wills, like Olmeda, because Olmeda only read part of the Yakumo, and you saw what it did to him. So what happens when the public are allowed to see part of the Yakumo? What happens to the world? I don't know. All we can say is that the Yakumo becomes the center of a religion. 30 years later, a new type of terrorism appeared. Heaven Tears. The meaning of terrorism changed again. So I guess, after Amir killed the final Heaven Smile, that really was it for the Heaven Smiles. They were gone. They were dead. No more Heaven Smiles. And I guess the world experienced some decades of peace where there was no terrorism. Until the year 2050 happened, and Heaven Tears begin. They appear. And now, when Heaven Tears appear, and when terrorism begins in the world again, what happens? Well, in 2053, the third Smith Syndicate was formed to combat the Heaven Tears terrorism. So once again, it's the Smiths versus Kunlan's Heaven Blanks. It just keeps on going. The second Smith Syndicate, of course, was no more after Garcian awoke. Who is in the third Smith Syndicate, however? It's not going to say. 100 years pass. We saw that in the game. And just like in the game, we now go to the year 2115 in Shanghai. The battle between Harmon Smith and Kunlan continues, as it ever does continue. The only difference being that Kunlan, at the beginning of the game, he tells Harmon that the world keeps shrinking to the size where you can control it in your hands. But in the year 2115, Kunlan says that the world will not change. All it does is turn. And the way I always interpreted that was that in the beginning of the game, Kunlan is dissatisfied with the status quo of the world. Maybe the West is in power and the East is not. And Kunlan wants to change that. In the year 2115, Kunlan says that the world won't change. So maybe the status quo has changed. Maybe the East is in power, and Kunlan is happy with that. So Kunlan feels that the world will not change, and maybe now Harmon is the one fighting to change the status quo of the world, and trying to empower the Western world once again. That's how I always interpreted that scene. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, I don't know, but that's what I thought was going on there. We move on to 2170. The final battle takes place in Detroit. Billions of final smiles fly to Detroit from the east. Overdrive, Mask the Smith, the main persona of the 5th Smith Syndicate, confronts the horde of final smiles. So I mentioned that there are things in this timeline that I really wish we could see in the game. And this is another one of them. Overdrive, Mask the Smith. I really want to see that. We cannot see that. All we know about whatever he is that he is the main persona of the 5th Smith Syndicate. So there was a 3rd, a 4th, and now a 5th, led by Mask the Smith. And Overdrive Mask the Smith confronts billions of smiles in Detroit. I want to see that game, but we never will. And after that, there's only one more entry on the timeline. We go to the final year, 2171. The chess game between Harmon Smith and Kunlan never ends, fearing his apparition. So it doesn't tell us who won in the final battle between Overdrive, Master Smith, and the Smiles. It doesn't tell us that. It tells us, though, that regardless of the outcome of the battle, the chess game between Harmon and Kunlan still goes on, still continues. It will never end. And I'm not sure how much to read into this, since, of course, I'm not reading the original Japanese. I am reading a translation. I don't know how accurate it is. But it says that the chess game never ends because they fear his apparition. So what does that mean? Does that mean that there is a third person who Harmon and Kunlan both fear? And maybe they play the chess game because they fear that he might appear? I don't know. I don't know how to read that. I don't know how much to read into that, since this is, again, a translation and I can't read that original Japanese. What is the meaning of this final line? of the timeline. What do you think it means? If you can read the actual Japanese, does it impart any additional meaning to this? I don't know. But it is an intriguing final line to say that the chess game between the two will never end because maybe there is a third being, a third entity that the two of them fear even more. But who knows who or what that might be. Well, regardless, that's the end of the timeline of Killer7. That's it. It gives us a good deal of information, though, just like with every other section in this book, it tells us maybe not as much information as we would like. Plenty of things we don't know, such as, of course, what was Amir's choice? Did he shoot Matsuoka or not? Things like, well, just things like a whole lot of things, like what's the deal with Harmon and Kunlun in Shanghai at the end? What are they fighting over? What are the Heaven Tears? I mean, I'm going to assume that the Heaven Tears are not just suicide bombers that cry instead of laugh. That seems like that would be disappointing. But we get a little bit of information from this, and I still like to think that Harmon Smith is definitely George Washington. And that's the plot of the game. George Washington versus a demon from Buddhism. That's what Killer7 is about. That's what the timeline has to tell us. That's what Hand in Killer7 has to tell us. And I hope that after going through this timeline, I hope that after going through all these sections in Hand in Killer7, that maybe the game and the story is a bit more understandable. Well, except maybe Alter Ego. Maybe that's not really all that much more understandable. Maybe the rest of it is. Or at least a little bit more understandable than it was the first time you may have played through the game, or the first time you watched the game. Maybe now there's more context towards everything that we have seen that maybe wasn't there before. But, we are still not quite done. Because there's one more thing we need to do. Throughout this entire LP, at the end of each video, we've been seeing a report. The reports from Jacob Checkbox that LPBot has been reading. We need to put all those together, and we need to figure out what information we can get from that, and how it ties in to the rest of this information that we get in Hand in Killer7. Jacob Checkbox, a very important character who's never mentioned in the game, nor is he mentioned in any other part in Hand of Killer7, yet he plays a big part in the game. Next time, for the final Killer7 supplement, we're going to look through those reports, and we're going to see what exactly we can find out about Jacob Checkbox and the effect that he had on the world of Killer7. I'll see you then for the end.